In a travelling fair's painted caravans, traditional wisdom meets ancient danger. When Gallagher's fair arrives in Yorkshire, old magic is pitted against darker forces, and a clash between enemies becomes a battle that could reshape the very fabric of reality. This is Victorian Cthulhu, Episode 5, The Parlay of Powers. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the village fields where Gallagher's travelling show had transformed the meadow into a wonderland of painted canvas and gleaming brass. Despite the first hints of autumn's chill in the air, the fair hummed with activity as Yorkshire folk seized what might be their last opportunity for outdoor revelry before winter's arrival. Will Chester stood triumphant beside the coconut shy, a perfectly intact coconut cradled in his hands like a trophy. 3 throws, 3 hits, he announced with considerable satisfaction, presenting his prize to Victoria with an elaborate bow. For you, Miss Pemberton, the spoils of victory. Victoria accepted the coconut with theatrical gravity, examining it as though it were a rare artifact. Mr. Chester, your prowess with a cricket ball is impressive, though I confess myself uncertain how one properly consumes such a formidable specimen. No matter at all, Will replied, his attention already caught by the cheerful call of a vendor nearby. Look there, chestnuts, the first of the season, I'd wager. He approached the small man tending a glowing brazier, purchasing a paper cone filled with the fragrant, steaming nuts. Much more practical than coconuts, and considerably warmer. They had barely begun sharing the chestnuts when Isabel appeared through the crowd, accompanied by a striking figure who immediately drew the eye. The woman moved with the elegant poise of someone accustomed to being watched, her vibrant silk scarves catching the light as she walked. Her dark hair was elaborately arranged beneath a jewelled headband, and her Mediterranean complexion spoke of warm places far from Yorkshire's moors. "Victoria, Mr. Chester," Isabel called as she approached. "I'd like you to meet someone very special. This is Madame Dina, an old friend and mentor of mine." The woman extended her hand with elegant authority. "A pleasure," she said, her accent rich and melodious. "Isabel has told me much about her new companions. You are the ones helping with the difficulties in this area, yes?" "Among other things," Victoria replied carefully, studying Madame Dina with curiosity. There was an unmistakable presence about her, a magnetism that went beyond mere theatrical costume. "Good. These matters, they require understanding, traditional understanding." Dina's dark eyes held knowledge that seemed ancient despite her relatively youthful appearance. "You will join me this evening, all of you, a proper meal, and we will discuss what shadows have fallen across this land." Isabel smiled warmly. "Madame Dina is very precious to me. She taught me much about the spiritual world when I was younger." "The travelling folk have their own ways," Dina explained, adjusting her shawls with practiced grace. "Old ways. We see things that others miss, feel currents that run beneath the surface of this world." She glanced around the cheerful chaos of the fair. "This place, it is touched by something unnatural. But we find Miss Isabel here, with friends, standing against it. This is not coincidence." "Where shall we meet?" Will inquired, ever practical. "Come to our camp as the sun touches the horizon. We will feast properly and speak of serious matters." Dina inclined her head graciously before melting back into the crowd with a fluid motion. Isabel watched her go with obvious affection. The travelling people have their own kind of magic, real magic, nothing like the parlour tricks some mediums employ. Dina taught me to trust my instincts about the supernatural world. "Speaking of instincts," Victoria said, glancing around, "where is Uncle Nate? Surely he should have arrived by now?" "He was waiting for that telephone connection to Professor Blackwood," Will explained. "Such arrangements take considerable time, especially for long-distance communications." Victoria grinned mischievously. "Or perhaps he's deliberately prolonging the process. Somehow I suspect county fairs aren't quite his natural habitat." They spent the next hour wandering among the attractions, Will testing his strength at the hammer game while Victoria observed the fortune-tellers with cheerful skepticism. The fair provided a welcome respite from their recent investigations, allowing them to remember what normal pleasures felt like. When Nathaniel finally appeared, his serious expression formed a stark contrast to the carnival atmosphere surrounding him. He moved through the crowd like a man attending a business meeting rather than seeking entertainment. "Uncle Nate!" Victoria waved him over to where they had claimed a small table near the tea stand. "We've been waiting for you." "My apologies for the delay," he said, settling into his chair with visible discomfort at the surrounding merriment. The telephone connection proved educational. Will's expression grew alert. Professor Blackwood had information? Indeed. Rather significant information, I believe. Nathaniel glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard, then continued in lower tones. He's been researching our previous encounters. The others drew closer, sensing the gravity in his voice. "Shub Negrath," Nathaniel said carefully, as though the syllables themselves carried danger. An entity referenced in several obscure texts dating back centuries. The descriptions are disturbing. References to the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, associated with fertility corrupted into grotesque abundance, nature turned malevolent and wrong. Isabel shivered despite the warm afternoon. Twisted fertility, like the creature at Hobson's farm, and we saw that goat in the forest. The journals speak of it as ancient beyond human comprehension, Nathaniel continued. Something that exists outside our normal understanding of the world. Professor Blackwood believes our coven has somehow made contact with this entity, perhaps even summoned an aspect of it. But how? Victoria asked. And more importantly, what do they want from it? Those are precisely the questions we need to answer, Nathaniel replied grimly. The professor is conducting further research, but he cautioned that the available sources are fragmentary and often written by individuals who may have been driven to madness by their discoveries. A moment of sobering silence fell over the group as they contemplated the implications. Around them, the fair continued its cheerful chaos, children laughing and vendors calling their wares, blissfully unaware of the cosmic horrors being discussed at their small table. "Well then," Will said finally, "all the more reason to enjoy normal pleasures while we can." He stood and gestured toward the fair's centerpiece. An elaborate steam-powered carousel with painted horses rising and falling to the accompaniment of cheerful organ music. We agreed to wait for Mr. Milbane before taking our ride. Nathaniel looked at the carousel with the expression of a man facing execution. "Surely you don't seriously expect—" "Oh, but we do," Victoria interrupted with obvious delight. Nathaniel surveyed their expectant faces and recognized the futility of resistance. With the resigned air of a man accepting his fate, he allowed himself to be led toward the steam-powered carousel, where painted horses waited to carry even the most serious detective inspector on a journey back to childhood wonder. The sun had settled behind the Yorkshire hills, leaving the sky painted in deep purples and amber. The travellers' camp lay nestled in a sheltered hollow, where a large fire crackled warmly against the growing chill. Orange light danced across the painted sides of caravans, arranged in a protective circle, their bright colours muted to rich shadows in the firelight. Isabel led them through the camp, past hobbled horses and hanging lanterns, to where blankets had been spread around the central fire. The smell of wood smoke mixed with savoury aromas from a large pot suspended over the flames. "Miss Strathmore," called a cheerful voice with a distinct Irish lilt. A man of middle years approached, his weather-beaten face creased with genuine warmth. "Welcome back to our fire." "Danny Gallagher," Isabel said, making the introductions. "I'd like you to meet my colleagues." The Irishman extended his hand with the easy manner of someone accustomed to meeting strangers. "Any friends of Miss Isabel's is welcome at our fire." "Mr. Gallagher," Nathaniel replied, studying the man with the automatic assessment of long police experience. An honest face, he judged, though one that had seen its share of hardship. "And here," Isabel continued, as an elderly woman was helped toward the fire by two younger travellers, "is Mrs. Murphy." The old woman moved slowly but with dignity, one hand resting on her escort's arm. Her face was deeply lined, and Nathaniel noted immediately that one eye was completely milky white, while the other showed the beginning signs of similar deterioration. Yet despite her apparent blindness, she seemed to navigate the uneven ground with surprising confidence. "Mrs. Murphy sees more than the rest of us," Dina said, appearing beside them with graceful silence, though perhaps not with her eyes. Nathaniel turned to the fortune-teller, studying her Mediterranean features in the firelight. "You are Egyptian, I believe?" Dina's eyebrows rose with genuine surprise. "Very good, Mr. Milbane. Most English assume all dark-skinned travellers are Roma. You have a good ear." "My work involves a lot of listening," Nathaniel replied. "Accents often reveal as much as words." "A detective's skill," Dina acknowledged with approval. "Isabel spoke truly when she said you were perceptive." Danny gestured for them to settle onto the blankets around the fire. "Now then, let's have some proper food. The night's getting cold, and there's nothing like hot soup to chase away autumn's bite." Soon they were cradling wooden bowls filled with rich, hearty stew, the warmth seeping through their fingers. Danny appeared with tankards of foaming ale, apologizing as he offered them to Victoria and Isabel. "I'm afraid ale's all we have to offer the ladies tonight. Not very refined, I know." Victoria accepted her tankard with amusement. "Mr. Gallagher, I've discovered that good ale beats poor tea any day." "And I've always preferred honest drink to polite pretense," Isabel added, raising her tankard in salute. The meal proceeded with comfortable conversation until Dina's expression grew serious. "Now, we should speak of why you're truly here. This land carries a sickness that even we can feel." Nathaniel set down his bowl. "What exactly do you sense?" "Disruption," Mrs. Murphy spoke for the first time, her voice carrying surprising strength. "The natural cycle's broken, something ancient stirring that should remain still." "We've encountered a group," Nathaniel explained carefully, "a coven of folk who seem to be practicing some form of witchcraft. Our recent research suggests they may have summoned something called Shub Negrath." Danny exchanged glances with Dina. "We know nothing of that name, but what you describe." He shook his head grimly. "Something older than the earth's rhythms," Mrs. Murphy continued. "Older than the proper order of things. It does not belong in this world." Isabel sat forward earnestly. "Could you help us? Your knowledge, your abilities, surely together we could find a way to stop this." Dina's expression grew sympathetic but firm. "Miss Isabel, we share what wisdom we have freely, but the way of the travelling folk is to remain apart from local conflicts. We do not take sides in the affairs of settled people." "But this affects everyone," Victoria protested. "If this entity grows stronger—" "We have our own protections," Danny interrupted gently. "Defences to shield ourselves from unnatural influences. It's what's kept our people safe for generations." "What sort of defences?" Victoria asked with obvious curiosity. Mrs. Murphy smiled, the expression transforming her weathered features. "Tell them of Vardo's kiss, Danny." "Ah, our greatest treasure," the Irishman said with evident pride. "A large talisman of iron and silver, blessed by generations of our people. Beautiful thing it is, covered in symbols that hold real power." "Vardo's kiss," Victoria repeated, her voice carrying a note of romance. "What a beautiful name." "Beautiful and practical," Danny agreed. "It acts a ward against supernatural harm." The conversation might have continued, but suddenly the peaceful evening was shattered by shouts from across the field. Dogs began barking frantically, and figures could be seen running toward them through the darkness. "Danny! Danny!" A young man burst into the circle of firelight, his face pale with shock. "Come quickly! Something terrible's happened!" The camp leader was on his feet instantly, followed by the other travellers. Nathaniel and his group hurried after them as they rushed toward the commotion, lanterns bobbing in the darkness like fireflies. They found a crowd gathered around one of the larger caravans at the camp's edge. People were speaking in hushed, horrified tones, and several women were crying softly. "Let me through," Danny commanded, and the crowd parted to reveal a young man lying motionless beside the caravan steps. Teddy Quinn. Danny said grimly. "One of our work hands." "The caravan," Dina said urgently, pushing past them to climb the steps. They heard her moving about inside, then a cry of anguish that chilled them all. She emerged a moment later, her face stricken. "The talisman chest has been broken open." Nathaniel's expression hardened. "Murder, then?" "It's worse than that," Dina said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where Vardo's kiss was kept. The talisman has been stolen." The crowd around the caravan had grown larger, voices rising in distressed murmurs as more travellers gathered to witness the tragedy. Nathaniel observed the chaos with the practiced eye of a man who had worked too many crime scenes, and his professional instincts reasserted themselves with startling clarity. "Everyone step back, please," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect at Scotland Yard. "I need this area cleared immediately." Victoria moved toward him. "Uncle Nate, shouldn't we send for the police? This is clearly—" "That won't be necessary," Danny interrupted firmly, his earlier warmth replaced by steely resolve. "We prefer to handle our own affairs, Miss Pemberton. The travelling folk have little reason to trust outside authorities." Nathaniel studied the Irishman's face, recognizing the deep-seated wariness of a people who had learned caution through bitter experience. Though every fibre of his training demanded proper procedure, he sensed that pressing the matter now would only alienate potential allies. "Very well," he said quietly, "but I'll need your cooperation to understand what happened here." Danny nodded curtly. "Whatever you need." "Mr. Gallagher, Madam Dina," Nathaniel continued, slipping effortlessly back into his investigative role, "I need you to keep everyone calm and away from this area. More importantly, find out if anyone witnessed anything unusual this evening, anyone acting strangely, unfamiliar faces, anything out of the ordinary. Bring them to me directly." As the crowd dispersed under Danny's gentle but firm direction, Nathaniel turned his attention to the scene before him. The lantern light flickered across poor Teddy Quinn's still form, and Nathaniel knelt beside the body with the careful reverence of a man who had seen too much death to treat it carelessly. "Mr. Chester, Miss Pemberton," he said softly, "I'll need more light here." They positioned themselves to cast the best illumination, while Isabel remained at a respectful distance, her face pale but resolute. Nathaniel began his examination with methodical precision, checking for signs of struggle, wounds, or other evidence of violence. "No obvious external injuries," he murmured, more to himself than the others. "But look here." He gestured toward the young man's mouth, which appeared to be partially open in an unnatural way. With careful fingers, Nathaniel examined the victim's jaw, then began to extract what appeared to be plant matter from between the lips. As he pulled forth twisted twigs, dried grass, and fragments of bramble, Will's sharp intake of breath broke the tense silence. "Sticks and straw," Will said grimly. "We've encountered this before." "Indeed we have," Nathaniel replied, continuing his grim work. The amount of material was shocking, far more than could have been placed there naturally. "This bears all the hallmarks of our coven's handiwork, the same corrupted vegetation we found in previous incidents." Victoria watched with a mixture of fascination and revulsion as Nathaniel carefully laid out the extracted plant matter on a clean handkerchief. Even in the uncertain light, there was something wrong about it, the way it seemed to writhe slightly as though not entirely dead. As they pondered the mystery, Danny returned with a young man in tow, clearly one of the stable hands, his clothes smelling of horses and his gait slightly unsteady. "This is Michael," Danny said. "He says he saw something." The stable hand shuffled nervously, glancing between the assembled faces. "I'd had a few cups of ale, mind you, so I might have been seeing things." "Tell me exactly what you observed," Nathaniel said gently, his tone designed to put the witness at ease. "Every detail, no matter how strange it might seem." Michael scratched his head uncertainly. "Well, I was tending to the horses around the time we heard the commotion start, and I could swear I saw Teddy running out of that caravan there, across the field toward the village, moving fast. He was, like something had spooked him proper." "You're certain it was Teddy?" Nathaniel asked. "Looked like him, sir. Same height, same way of moving. But," Michael frowned, struggling with the memory, "something felt wrong about it. Can't say what, exactly. Just wrong." Nathaniel nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Michael. Your eyes may not have been playing tricks on you after all." As the stable hand returned to the crowd, Nathaniel turned to his companions with a grim expression. "We've encountered this pattern before. Someone taking another's appearance, using it as a disguise." "Annie Briggs," Victoria said immediately, understanding flooding her features. "Almost certainly," Nathaniel agreed, "though it could be another coven member with similar abilities. The question is whether poor Teddy stumbled upon the theft in progress, or whether his death was part of a larger plan." Isabel shivered in the cool night air. To think she was here, among all these innocent people. "The Veil of Stars," Will added quietly. "She could have been anyone, walking among the travellers undetected." As they stood contemplating the implications, Danny approached them again, his face heavy with exhaustion and grief. "I think it might be best if we all retired for the evening," he said wearily. "The shock of this, it's hit everyone hard. Perhaps we could speak again in the morning, make proper plans about what's to be done." Nathaniel glanced once more at the covered form of Teddy Quinn, then at the violated caravan where Vardo's kiss had been kept. The night had begun with hope, the possibility of allies in their fight against the coven. Now they found themselves facing an enemy grown bolder and more desperate, willing to commit murder for whatever dark purpose drove them. "Of course," he said finally, "but I would suggest posting guards tonight, if the coven struck once." "Aye," Danny agreed grimly. "We'll not be caught off guard again." The walk back to their cottages passed in troubled silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what the theft of Vardo's kiss might mean. The autumn night felt colder now, shadows deeper and more threatening. Behind them, the travelling folks' camp remained ablaze with nervous activity as a community tried to come to terms with violence visited upon their peaceful world. As they reached their door, Victoria turned back toward the distant glow of the camp. "They came for that talisman specifically," she said. "This wasn't random." "No," Nathaniel agreed, his voice heavy with foreboding. "Which means the coven's plans are advancing, and now they have whatever power that talisman provided." The implications of that hung unspoken in the cool night air as they finally sought the dubious comfort of their beds, knowing that sleep would be long in coming. The tent had been transformed overnight into something resembling a military command post. Maps were spread across a central table, lanterns hung at strategic points to cast steady light, and the usual cheerful chaos of the travelling fair had been replaced by grim purpose. As Victoria entered, she felt as though she were stepping into a war room where crucial battles would be planned. Danny Gallagher sat at the head of the makeshift table, his usual warmth replaced by steely determination. Madame Dina occupied the seat to his right, while Mrs. Murphy sat with quiet dignity despite her failing sight. Several other fair folk completed the circle, their faces bearing the same resolute expression that spoke of a people pushed beyond their limits. A young fair worker moved quietly among them, setting down steaming mugs of tea and small plates of bread. The girl, Nora, Victoria recalled from the previous evening, worked with efficient silence, her presence so unobtrusive as to be almost invisible. "Please, sit," Danny said, as the four took their places around the table. The formality of his tone made clear that this was no casual gathering. "We've asked you here," Dina began without preamble, "because we need to understand exactly what we're facing. Last night's events have shown us that our usual policy of remaining apart from local conflicts is no longer viable." Danny's jaw tightened. Teddy Quinn was a good lad. He deserved better than to die for someone else's dark purposes. We want justice for what was done to him. "Does this mean you've decided to help us?" Isabel asked hopefully. "Actually," Danny replied with a bitter smile, "we're hoping you will help us. This has become our fight now, and we need to know everything about what we're up against." The circus folk listened quietly as the group provided a comprehensive account of their encounters with the coven. They described the escalating supernatural incidents, the growing corruption of the land, and their belief that the coven had recently gained access to significantly more power than before. "They seem almost reckless with it," Will observed, "as though they don't fully understand what they're wielding." "But there's definitely purpose behind their actions," Nathaniel added. "Everything points to their base of operations being Glen Mill, under the leadership of a woman called Mrs. Selina Bone." Dina leaned forward with obvious interest. "You mentioned an artifact as the source of their power. Tell me more about this." Victoria and Nathaniel exchanged glances before Victoria began. "There are 7 artifacts in total, each created to serve as a binding focus for something called a dream spawn of Cthulhu, ancient entities trapped deep beneath the earth. Think of them as offspring or heralds of an even more terrible force," Isabel added softly. "Something bound in the deepest places." "Each artifact has the power to draw forth a vault from underground," Nathaniel continued, "and prolonged ritual work can use that connection to weaken or break the bindings that hold these dream-spawn captive." "We've encountered these artifacts before," Will explained. "They're incredibly dangerous. The Shard of Nakai could animate and control the dead. The Key of Yoth could dominate human minds completely." "And the one you believe the Coven possesses?" Dina pressed. "The Veil of Stars," Victoria replied. "It allows the wearer to take on the appearance of others, as we saw with Annie Briggs's deception at Baildon Manor." Mrs. Murphy spoke for the first time, her voice carrying quiet authority. "How can you be certain this coven possesses one of these artifacts?" Nathaniel hesitated, then answered carefully. "My previous contact with one of these objects appears to have left me sensitive to their presence. I can sense them, though the ones I haven't directly encountered resonate more weakly in my mind." The discussion turned to the fair folks' plans, which proved to be disturbingly direct. "We'll challenge them," Danny declared. "Seek our own justice for Teddy's murder. They'll learn what happens when they spill travelling folk blood." "Mr. Gallagher, I understand your desire for justice," Victoria said urgently, "but the power they wield—" "Is considerable, yes," Dina interrupted, "but we're not without resources of our own." As the others continued debating the wisdom of direct confrontation, Nathaniel fell silent. He sat motionless, his eyes distant, as though listening to something only he could hear. The familiar buzzing sensation that had plagued him since Oxford was present again, stronger than it had been in days. But there was something different about it now, something immediate. Without a word, he leaned toward Madame Dina and whispered urgently in her ear. Her eyes widened with understanding, and she immediately turned to Mrs. Murphy, speaking in equally low tones. The elderly seer bowed her head for a moment, as though consulting some inner sight. When she raised it again, she lifted one gnarled finger and pointed directly at the serving girl. "Nora," she said simply. "Caesar!" Nathaniel commanded, erupting from his chair. The reaction of the travelling folk was immediate and coordinated. Within seconds, strong hands had grasped the girl's arms, preventing any possibility of escape. She struggled briefly, then stood still with obvious defiance. Nathaniel approached her carefully, his fingers reaching toward her shoulder. There, almost invisible against her clothing, was something that seemed to shift and shimmer, a fabric so translucent it was nearly ethereal, like captured moonlight woven into silk. He grasped the gossamer material and pulled it away from her. The transformation was instantaneous and startling. The young serving girl's features flowed like water, reshaping themselves into the sharp, angular face of Annie Briggs. Her dark hair lengthened, her build became more substantial, and her eyes filled with cold intelligence. "Keep her held tightly," Will said, with evident satisfaction. "This one has a talent for slipping away when you least expect it." He stepped closer to their captive. "Well, Miss Briggs, it seems your little masquerade has come to an end. You won't be playing any more tricks on us." Annie remained silent, but her expression radiated contempt and defiance. "Place her in a cage of iron," Dina commanded sharply. Search her thoroughly, then secure her where she cannot use whatever other tricks she might possess." As several of the fair folk moved to comply, Annie finally spoke, her voice carrying venomous satisfaction despite her capture. "You think this changes anything? You have no idea what forces you're meddling with." "I am sure you said as much last time," Victoria said back coolly. "Only this time you are wrong, as now we do." "Take her away," Dina said dismissively. As Annie was led from the tent, still radiating defiant fury, Danny turned to the others with a thoughtful expression. "Well then," he said slowly, "this may change our plans dramatically. It appears we now have some leverage of our own." Victoria caught Nathaniel's eye. She could read his expression easily. He was weighing up whether these events had made the situation better or worse. The iron cage had been positioned in a secluded area behind the main cluster of caravans, away from curious eyes, but close enough that guards could maintain constant watch. Annie Briggs sat within its confines with the rigid posture of someone who refused to show weakness, even in captivity. Her dark eyes held nothing but contempt as the group approached. Nathaniel took the lead, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he had perfected during years of police interrogations. "Miss Briggs, I trust you understand the gravity of your situation. Murder, theft, conspiracy." "What I understand," Annie interrupted coldly, "is that you've made a grave error in interfering with forces beyond your comprehension." Danny stepped forward, his Irish accent thickening with controlled anger. "You killed Teddy Quinn, a good lad who never hurt anyone in his life. Why?" Annie's lips curved into a mirthless smile. "Ask me again when you have something more persuasive than moral outrage." For the next several minutes, both men tried different approaches, appeals to conscience, threats of legal consequences, even attempts to bargain for information. Annie met each effort with stony silence or mocking dismissal. She seemed to take particular pleasure in their growing frustration. "This is getting us nowhere," Dina said finally, her voice calm but masking impatience. "I have a better idea." She moved away from the cage, returning shortly with several small bunches of herbs, rosemary, vervain, and others that Victoria couldn't immediately identify. Working with deliberate precision, Dina tied one bundle to each corner of the iron cage, moving in what appeared to be a specific pattern. Mrs. Murphy rose from her chair with surprising grace for one so elderly, joining Dina as she began to walk slowly around the cage. Both women began speaking in low voices, words that seemed to belong to no language Victoria recognized, yet carried an undeniable sense of power and purpose. Isabel leaned close to Victoria, whispering, "This is remarkable, true binding magic, not the parlour tricks some claim to practice." Victoria nodded quietly, though she found herself less enthused than concerned by what she was witnessing. The air around the cage seemed to thicken, and she could feel something fundamental shifting in the space between them and their prisoner. As the ritual concluded, Dina turned to face the group with evident satisfaction. She is now bound to the truth for 7 days and 7 nights. Every question asked of her must be answered, and every word she speaks must be truthful. The change in Annie was immediate and unsettling. The defiant gleam left her eyes, replaced by something flat and emotionless. When she spoke, her voice carried no trace of anger, fear, or mockery, only a soft dullness that was somehow more disturbing than her earlier hostility. "What is the purpose of your coven?" Nathaniel asked. "The coven's goals have always been to improve the lives of the village," Annie replied in that eerily neutral tone. "But now our goals are greater. As we consolidate our power and claim ancient forces for ourselves, there will be no limits to what we can achieve." "Did you kill Teddy Quinn?" Danny demanded. "Yes, he discovered me in the caravan where the talisman was kept. I could not allow him to raise an alarm, so I used the old ways to silence him permanently." The casual, emotionless delivery of such horrific details sent a chill through the assembled group. "And what of Nora?" Victoria asked. "The real Nora, did she suffer the same fate?" She can be found down by the stream, where you do your laundry. I struck her unconscious when I took her form. She is probably not dead, but perhaps she is." The complete absence of concern in Annie's voice made the words even more chilling. Danny immediately turned and ran from the area, returning minutes later. "I've sent people to find her," he said grimly. "Why did you steal Vardo's kiss?" Nathaniel continued the interrogation. "The power we wield is growing so fast that Selina is losing her grip on it. The entity is bound to us through ritual, but the binding must be renewed on every full moon. Last time, it was only a partial success. The creature we have summoned is breaking free of our control. For the next binding ritual, we need more power to hold it in place." "Shub Negrath," Nathaniel said carefully, watching for her reaction. Annie's expression remained blank. "If that is the name of the being, then it is new to me. Selina describes her as a goddess of nature, ancient and powerful beyond human understanding." "A goddess that corrupts and destroys everything it touches," Isabel said with evident disgust. "How can you participate in something so fundamentally wrong?" Annie showed no response to the moral condemnation, her face remaining as impassive as carved stone. As the interrogation continued, one of the fair folk who had gone searching returned with news. "We found Nora," he reported to Danny. "She's injured, but she'll recover." "Madam Dina, she's been taken to your caravan for treatment." Dina nodded with visible relief before turning back to the group. "Now we must decide what to do with this information. We have something the Coven wants desperately, both their member and their artifact. I suggest we call for a parley and trade." "We can't simply exchange the artifact back to them," Victoria protested. "It's far too dangerous in their hands." Danny's eyes gleamed with cunning satisfaction. "Oh, we don't have to actually go through with any trade, but I think it's an excellent idea. It's time we met Mrs. Selina Bone face to face." Nathaniel nodded thoughtfully. A direct confrontation on neutral ground. It could provide valuable intelligence about their true capabilities. "I'll send a runner to Glen Mill," Danny decided. "We'll offer an exchange, the Veil of Stars and Annie Briggs in return for our talisman, and, well, we'll see what they're willing to discuss." The messenger was dispatched with instructions to propose a meeting, and the group settled in to wait. The morning passed with nervous tension as they prepared for what might come next. When the runner finally returned, he carried news that the Coven had agreed to the proposed meeting. 1 hour before sunset, he reported, at the warding stone where the beck meets the river. Mrs. Bone will attend personally, along with 3 others. We too must send only 4. As the group began preparations for what promised to be a dangerous encounter, Victoria found herself wondering whether they were walking into a trap of their own making. But with the Coven's power growing and time running short before the next full moon, it seemed they had little choice but to take the risk. The path to the warding stone wound through increasingly wild terrain, where ancient oak trees cast long shadows in the fading light. Mrs. Murphy walked with surprising steadiness for one so elderly, her hand resting lightly on Nathaniel's elbow for guidance. Beside them, Dina and Isabel moved with the quiet tension of those preparing for battle. "I understand why you chose Mr. Milbane for his observational skills, and myself for other reasons," Isabel said quietly. "But I would certainly feel a lot better if my other colleagues were here." "Danny was also very frustrated to be left behind," Dina replied. "But this was certainly the wisest choice given our number limitations. 4 against 4, no advantage to either side." The warding stone stood in a small clearing where an ancient beck meandered toward the river, its weathered surface carved with symbols that predated written memory. They had barely taken their positions when the sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of the Coven's delegation. The woman who entered the clearing commanded attention through sheer presence alone. She was tall and elegant, moving with fluid grace. 3 other women followed in her wake, taking positions behind her with the disciplined silence of those who knew their place in a carefully ordered hierarchy. "My name is Madame Dina," Dina said with formal courtesy. "This is my colleague, Mrs. Murphy. Thank you for agreeing to speak with us." A moment of silence stretched between them as the woman studied their group with obvious calculation. Isabel found herself studying their opponent in return. Her skin was pale as winter moonlight, providing stark contrast to hair so black it seemed to absorb the dying light around her. The midnight blue velvet of her dress whispered against itself as she walked, and when she smiled, her dark eyes, so deep brown they appeared almost black, remained stern and cold. "I have no interest in what your names are," the woman replied eventually, her voice rich and thick as honey, "but I am pleased to see you, Lady Isabel Strathmore." Isabel found herself bracing under scrutiny. "Do send my regards to Mrs. Crowther," she continued, with that same smooth delivery, pausing just long enough to let the implications settle, "and your father, and tell them I am delighted to hear that your brother has made a full recovery from his recent affliction." The way she spoke the last word, with a smile that never reached her eyes, made it clear she expected them to understand exactly what she meant. It was a calculated provocation designed to rattle Isabel's composure. Nathaniel glanced at Isabel, ready to intervene if the bait proved effective, but Isabel remained admirably unflapped by the obvious attempt at manipulation. "Mrs. Bone," Isabel acknowledged with cool politeness. "Let us not waste any more time with pleasantries and get straight to the heart of the matter," Dina interjected. "The way I see it, I have two things that you want, Miss Briggs and your artifact. Whereas you only have one thing of ours, it would appear that we have you at a disadvantage." Selina's laugh was like silver bells touched with frost. "Oh, you can keep the girl. I have no real interest in her. She is easily replaceable. And the artifact I've taken from you is barely more than a primitive bauble. I don't see that you can be so keen to have it back." She paused, letting her gaze sweep over them with theatrical disdain. "However, my need for the veil will benefit us all. So whilst you may feel you're making some kind of economic trade, it would be in your best interest to surrender the veil and allow me to continue my affairs without these ridiculous distractions." "We are aware of your need for both artifacts, Mrs. Bone," Isabel replied steadily. "We are aware of the ritual you need to undertake, and we are aware of the risks you have created by undertaking the path you have taken." The change in Selina's demeanour was immediate and striking. The silk-smooth voice turned sharp. "If you are aware of such things, Lady Strathmore, then you are also aware of the consequences should the ritual not be completed. Should my goddess be fully unleashed, there will be dire ramifications for all involved." She paused theatrically, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the clearing like a shroud. "So I have a proposition for you. Return to me what is mine, my artifact, and I will merely borrow your bauble. In a week's time, once the ritual of the moon has been re-established and strengthened, I will return it to you, and you can go about whatever small lives you lead." The silence that followed was broken by Mrs. Murphy's voice, quiet but carrying absolute certainty. "She lies." Selina's eyes fixed on the elderly seer with sudden interest. "Ooh, I sense you do have someone with genuine power among you. What a shame that she is already at death's door. She would have made a wonderful addition to my coven." Mrs. Murphy made no reply, her milky eyes staring sightlessly ahead. "We don't need powers to know that you can't be trusted, Mrs. Bone," Dina said firmly. "You've made that perfectly clear already. You will not get your hands on your artifact until you have handed over the one that you have stolen." "Well then," Selina said, her voice returning to its earlier honeyed tones, "let's try this in a more interesting way." She made a small gesture with her hand by her side, seemingly casual but obviously deliberate. Nathaniel noticed immediately that the ground beneath her seemed to shift and move as though something beneath the earth was stirring to life. Around the clearing, sticks and twigs began to move of their own accord, drawn together by some invisible force. They twisted and coalesced, taking shape, and within moments, a massive tiger-shaped beast stood before them, constructed entirely of wicker, straw, and forest debris, its eyes glowing with unnatural light. "We don't need to rely on diplomatic means to resolve this situation," Selina said, her voice now carrying open menace. "I think I will be taking what is mine." The tiger began to pace forward with predatory grace, its wooden limbs moving with unsettling fluidity. "How contemptible," Dina said, her voice filled with scorn, "to break a parley with violence, but if your beast was meant to intimidate me, I'm afraid you have failed. Perhaps you should come and visit our fair. We have 2 rather impressive real lions who I am sure would be pleased to make your acquaintance." "My understanding," Selina replied with cold amusement, "is that a tiger easily outmatches a lion." "That may be so," Dina said, as the creature continued its advance, "but that is no tiger. In fact, it is little more than a parlour trick." As she spoke, she withdrew something from the folds of her dress. What Isabel could see was a coin or coin-shaped object made of iron. With practiced ease, Dina flicked the iron disc through the air. It arced gracefully before landing squarely on the tiger's back. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The creature crumpled instantly, its supernatural animation shattered, collapsing back into nothing more than a pile of ordinary sticks and straw. Dina's satisfaction lasted only moments. A strange tremoring began to spread through the clearing, the very ground beneath their feet seeming to pulse with unnatural rhythm. The air grew thick and oppressive, and darkness began to fall with alarming speed, far faster than the approaching sunset could account for. Above them, the sky seemed to press downward, as though something vast and terrible was pushing against the barriers between worlds. "Oh dear," Selina said, though her voice carried more satisfaction than concern. "It appears you have weakened the binding of my goddess even further with your negating magic. It would appear now that she has found the crack she needs to come completely through into this realm." The tremoring intensified, and in the growing darkness, something vast and hungry stirred just beyond the edge of sight, waiting for its moment to break free into a world unprepared for its terrible presence. The tremors continued to intensify, each pulse seeming to tear at the very fabric of the world around them. The unnatural darkness pressed closer, as though something vast and hungry was pushing against the barriers between realms, seeking any weakness it could exploit. "This was your intention," Nathaniel said, his voice cutting through the growing chaos. "This is what you planned." Selina's laugh held no warmth. "Is that what you think, Mr. Milbane? If my goddess manages to find her way through this crack we have created, the first thing she would do is destroy us all, consume every living thing in her path. I hardly think that would be a particularly sensible plan." Nathaniel, despite the chaos, made a grim note that Selina had been well aware of who he was despite no introduction being given. "She speaks the truth," Mrs. Murphy said quietly, her milky eyes turned toward the darkness above them. "About the consuming, the goddess would devour all." "Oh, she is delightful," Selina said, the only member of the parlay showing no outward signs of alarm. "Such clarity of vision." "The tremors are getting worse," Dina said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "What can we do?" "There is only one option," Selina replied, her theatrical composure never wavering. "We must perform a smaller version of the binding ritual of the moon. It won't hold as much power, but it should be enough to close this small crack that your magic has created." As she spoke, she withdrew an object from within her cloak, which Isabel realized was Vardo's kiss, a lantern-like object, crafted from what appeared to be dull iron decorated with elegant silver filigree. "We will need both artifacts for this," she said, setting the object carefully on the ground, "and we don't have an awful lot of time." "She is right," Isabel said, studying the oppressive darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. "The situation appears fairly urgent." Dina withdrew the veil of stars from her clothing, the gossamer fabric seeming to catch and hold what little light remained in the clearing. As she did so, Nathaniel felt his suspicions crystallize into certainty. His first instinct had been correct. This was exactly the outcome Selina had wanted, both artifacts exposed and vulnerable, all of them desperate enough to cooperate with whatever she proposed. They spread the veil carefully on the forest floor, its ethereal fabric seeming to glow faintly against the dark earth. Selina placed Vardo's kiss directly atop the shimmering cloth like an altarpiece. "Mr. Milbane," Selina said with obvious disdain, "I suggest you stand back and let the people with real power manage the situation." As if responding to her words, the lantern flickered to life without any visible ignition, casting a small circle of steady light that seemed precious beyond measure in the encroaching darkness. The 7 women arranged themselves around the artifacts. "What do I do?" Isabel asked, feeling utterly out of her depth. "All you have to do is make yourself a conduit," Selina replied. "I will take care of the difficult part." Isabel tried to focus on becoming receptive to whatever forces Selina might channel, though she had little idea what that actually meant. Around the circle, she could see the others settling into positions of concentration, their faces illuminated by the lantern's gentle glow. Selina began to speak in what sounded like an ancient language, her voice taking on a rhythm that seemed to resonate with the tremors in the earth. The words were harsh and guttural, yet carried an undeniable power that made the air around them thrum with supernatural energy. The darkness above them seemed to respond to Selina's words, pressing downward with increasing intensity. It was as though 2 immense powers were locked in battle, the hungry void that sought to break through into their world, and the binding force that Selina was weaving around the artifacts. The battle between light and darkness intensified. Isabel found her vision beginning to narrow as the encroaching blackness pressed closer and closer to their small circle of illumination. The world beyond the lantern's glow disappeared entirely, leaving only the 7 women and their fragile island of light in an ocean of absolute void. Selina's voice reached a crescendo, the ancient words seeming to tear at the fabric of reality itself. The darkness responded with renewed fury, pressing down upon them with such force that Isabel felt as though she were being crushed beneath an invisible weight. The last thing Isabel remembered was the sensation of falling into an abyss so deep and black that it seemed to swallow not just light, but thought itself. She stirred to the gentle pressure of fingers tapping against her cheek, consciousness returning slowly like dawn breaking through heavy clouds. As her eyes focused, she saw Nathaniel's concerned face hovering above her. "Thank goodness," he said quietly. "I was beginning to worry." Isabel attempted to sit up, her head spinning with the effort. Around her, she could see Dina and Mrs. Murphy lying unconscious on the forest floor, though both appeared to be breathing steadily. "What happened?" she asked, her voice hoarse and uncertain. "I felt the darkness closing in around me," Nathaniel replied, cutting off all sensation except for that single point of light from the lantern. I tried to move toward it, the only source of illumination I could perceive. My hands closed over it, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up here. He held up Vardo's kiss, the iron and silver lantern now dark and cold in his hands. Mrs. Bone and her companions have vanished. Together, they roused Dina and Mrs. Murphy, both women recovering more quickly than Isabel had. As the group took stock of their situation, the implications became clear. "The Veil of Stars," Dina said. "It's gone." "Along with Mrs. Bone," Nathaniel confirmed. "Though we do have this back." He indicated the talisman in his hands. They stood in the clearing where the parley had begun, the oppressive darkness and supernatural tremors now gone as though they had never existed. The only evidence of what they had endured was their own exhaustion and the absence of their enemies. "So," Isabel said slowly, "do we consider this a victory?" It was a question none of them seemed able to answer with certainty. They had their protective talisman back, but Selina now possessed the Veil of Stars. As they began the long walk back to the travelling folks' camp, each was lost in private contemplation of what the night's events might mean for the battles yet to come. 3 days had passed since the parley at the warding stone, 3 days of uneasy quiet that felt more like the calm before a storm than any genuine peace. Isabel was mending a tear in one of her skirts when the knock came at the cottage door, a soft, respectful sound that somehow managed to convey both purpose and politeness. She opened the door to find Madame Dina and Danny Gallagher standing on the threshold, both dressed for travel and wearing expressions of genuine regret. "Madame Dina, Mr. Gallagher," Isabel said with obvious pleasure. "How wonderful to see you." "We just wanted to let you know that we are leaving in the morning," Dina said, her voice carrying sincere apology, "and we couldn't leave without coming to offer our thanks again for all the help and services you provided." "You're obviously very welcome," Isabel replied warmly, "but please, come in. After all the hospitality you have shown us, at least let me offer you some in return." She insisted despite their polite protests, bustling about to put the kettle on, while Victoria hurried to fetch Nathaniel and Will from the cottage next door. Soon all six were gathered around the small table in the sitting room, steam rising from cups of tea and the atmosphere carrying the peculiar mixture of warmth and melancholy that accompanies farewells. "I have to say, we're rather disappointed that you've decided to leave," Nathaniel said, his tone carefully neutral but his meaning clear. "We were rather hoping you would stay and be allies in what's to come." Danny shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I understand that. But with only 4 or 5 days till the full moon, and the coven lacking the means to complete their ritual properly," he shook his head grimly. "We're not quite sure what the consequences of that passing will be." "I am truly sorry to leave you and your friends with such a burden," Dina said, her dark eyes reflecting genuine regret. "But we have already made the mistake once of committing too heavily to affairs outside our own community. The consequences were nearly catastrophic. We lost someone, Isabel, and nearly another, good people who trusted me to keep them safe." She paused, fingering the edge of her shawl. "We have the artifact we need back to keep ourselves protected, and we have 1 or 2 more locations to visit before the end of our travelling season this year. Our first duty must be to our own people." "Of course," Isabel said gently. "We understand completely." "What became of Annie Briggs?" Will asked, practical as always. "I assume she's no longer your concern." "She has been properly turned over to the police," Danny confirmed with satisfaction. "The truth-binding lingered long enough for her to make full confession to all her murders and other deeds. Justice for Teddy Quinn, and proper closure for his family." "And justice for Mr. Frobisher as well," Isabel added quietly. "That gives me some peace, knowing he didn't die unremembered or unavenged." "Do you have any advice for us?" Victoria asked. "Any plans or ideas about how we might tackle what's coming?" Dina studied their faces with the keen eye of someone who had learned to read people's true feelings beneath their words. "You're putting on a brave front, but I can see the worry underneath. We may not be able to give you strategic counsel, but there is something else I can offer." She paused, reaching into a small bag she had brought with her, "which is why." She withdrew 4 delicate necklaces, each consisting of a fine iron chain supporting a small amulet. The pendants were simple iron discs, each bearing the shape of an eye carved into the metal. "We may not be able to give you an artifact as powerful as Vardo's kiss," she said, offering one to each of them, "but I have taken some time to create these small gifts. They may not have the same sort of power, but perhaps they will offer you a bit of traveller's protection in the challenges ahead." Isabel accepted hers with obvious gratitude, the metal warm against her palm. "These are beautiful. Thank you." "Iron for protection against supernatural influence," Nathaniel observed, fastening his around his neck, "and the eye for wisdom and clear sight." "Practical and meaningful," Will said approvingly, examining the careful craftsmanship. "These must have taken considerable time to make." "Time well spent," Victoria added, already wearing hers. "Thank you, Madame Dina, for everything." As they prepared to leave, Danny turned back at the door. "If you ever find yourselves in need of friends who understand the burden you carry, you'll know where to find us. The travelling folk don't forget their debts." "Nor do we forget our friends," Dina added, embracing Isabel warmly. "May the roads be kind to you, and may you find the answers you seek before it's too late." They watched from the cottage doorway as the 2 figures walked back toward their camp, soon to be packed up and moved on to whatever destination awaited them. The autumn evening was growing chill, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the faint sounds of the fair preparing for departure, caravans being packed, wheels being greased, the 100 small tasks that preceded a journey. "Well," Will said finally, "at least we're not facing this entirely alone." "No," Isabel agreed, touching the iron pendant at her throat. "And we do have allies now, even if they can't stay. That's something." Nathaniel nodded thoughtfully. "We know more than we did a week ago. We have Vardo's kiss back, we understand the scope of what we're facing, and we've seen that Selina Bone can be outmaneuvered, even if only temporarily." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in private thoughts about the challenges ahead. The task before them remained daunting, and time was growing short. But they had faced seemingly impossible odds before, and emerged victorious. As they finally turned to go back inside, the weight of the iron pendant against Isabel's throat felt reassuring. 4 days until the full moon, and then they would discover what consequences awaited when Selina's ritual failed to complete properly. But now they had allies who understood the burden they carried, and protection that might prove invaluable when the time came to act. The road ahead remained uncertain, but it no longer felt quite so solitary. The fair folk depart with dawn's first light, leaving behind protective talismans and the weight of unfinished business. 4 days remain until the full moon, and in the growing darkness, Selina Bone prepares her next move. The ancient bindings grow weaker, and something vast stirs in the spaces between worlds, waiting for its moment to break free. If you enjoyed this tale of old traditions, please give it a like. Likes, subscribes, and comments help the channel grow and guide other seekers of dark mystery through the mist to find us. Until next time, stay vigilant and keep your defenses strong.